what are we doing here? This is, I like this picture. This is really a nice picture. And it made me think, as a kid, invisibility did you ever fantasize about being able to be invisible? And sometimes good purposes and sometimes not so good purposes, but the idea of being invisible. So when there were characters like superheroes that could go invisible, I thought, that's like the best thing ever. You could just snap your fingers, go invisible, just like this picture. Where's the person? But there's the shadow. Doesn't make sense, but it's kind of cool. So I would, as a kid, think if I was invisible right now, I could do this and that. But unfortunately, it reveals your heart, because then you start thinking about all the things you can do to break the law when you're invisible, and how you can get back at all the people who hate you. I can punch them in the side of the head when they can't see you coming. And they don't know you're there until they feel you punch in the side of their head. I was in a lot of fights. That's what I'm saying. And so you could punch them in the side of the head, and you could sneak up on them, and by the time they realized you're there, you could move to another position so they wouldn't find you. Am I the only one that's kind of invisibility? And then, as a deep thinker as a kid, I also thought, well, being invisible, it does have some downsides. I think, like, for instance, being hit by cars. Cars don't see you. So if you're invisible, hey, you're on your own. You got to watch out for the cars. I found out that the cars in Brigham City think, as a pedestrian, I'm invisible, because I've almost been hit 3 or 4 times, and just because I don't know. As drivers, we don't look for pedestrians. So when I have the light to cross and they're turning their car, they just don't see you. And one time, right here next to Zion Bank on First North, I was just crossing across there, and a car turned from Main to go on First North, and they didn't see me, and if I hadn't jumped out of the way and pounded their fender with my fist, hey, and screamed at them, and then they looked up like, what? Then I realized being invisible may not be a good thing all the time. So being invisible is what I'm talking about here. So why am I talking about this? It'd be kind of nice to sort of fade away sometimes, be partially invisible. But then really the idea of being invisible is cool when you think about spies, right? Spies, they can go places and they can't be seen. This is, when I grew up, I was in the spy era. We had a lot of 007 stuff was big. Man from Uncle. Yeah. Whoa, everyone just dated themselves, yeah. So being invisible was kind of cool. If you can turn it on and off. I mean, that was really kind of a neat deal. And then there was this other character in this show that to be visible, he'd have to wrap his head and put on clothes and stuff like that, which made me think as a kid, wait a second, if I'm going to be invisible, do I have to walk around without clothes on? Okay, this is not as cool as I thought it was, because what happens if I click my finger at the wrong time and there I am with no clothes on? That would just be bad. Well, why are we talking about invisibility? Because today we're going to start a new 4 today. We did the 4 lonelies, the lonely 4 last time. We're doing another 4 right now of characters in the Bible who are they're invisible in a way, but instead of me saying they're invisible, I'm calling these people the unseen 4. So these are people who feel like they're invisible, that no one sees them. And of course, they're seen, but I'm talking about they're not really seen. And we're going to look at 4 characters and see how God reacts to people who consider themselves unseen. Yeah. So when I think about unseen, I'm actually, we'll tease this apart as we go along, but the unseen idea is about the fact we're not talking people who are actively despised, because when you despise someone, you see them and you're at them. They're not actively despised. What they are is just ignored. So people feel like they're unseen because they're ignored. They're just looked past. You can be in a group of people and no one sees you. Or, for instance, another contrast is the fact that you think they would be criticized for who they are, but we're not really talking about people who are actively criticized. We're talking about people who feel worthless because no one's paying attention to them. Even if they were criticized, actively criticized, they would feel like they're being seen, even though badly. You know how some kids and adults would rather do wrong to get a little attention than they get no attention at all. So this is a syndrome I'm talking about where people feel like nobody sees me, and sometimes you even do misdeeds in order to be seen. That's how critical it is. So it's a different kind of thing from being lonely, but it's similar, okay? It's connected. Or thirdly, you can think of the fact these aren't people who are being actively destroyed. These are people who in society are being exiled in the midst of society. Okay, so these are the unseen. And those are three characteristics. We'll see more of it as we go along. But the question really is, if you or me, if we feel as though in the circumstance we're in, we are unseen, it makes you start to feel like I'm not cared for. I'm not worthy to be seen. I don't measure up to the people who could see me. And so you just, like wallflower, you just sort of fade into the background and nobody cares about me. I'm just not seen. That's the syndrome we're talking about. So when God sees people like this, how does he respond? So today we're going to start way back in Genesis. Really? There's an unseen person in Genesis? Whoa, yes. And then for the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at people who are unseen in the New Testament. And we're going to see how Jesus, as God, how does he see them when other people refuse to see them? It's really neat. So we'll look at those 4 character sketches. That's the 4. So today we go way back to this guy right here. You recognize him, right? It's kind of a bad side. You take a picture from my good side. Well, this is Abram, or before he became Abraham, Abram. So we're going back pre-Abraham, so before God changed his name. Abram was an interesting guy. We're not just going to look at Abram himself. We're going to look at Abram and his wife Sarai before she's named Sarah. Okay, Sarai. So we're going to look at them because they dominate this part of the story very early on in the life of Abram and Sarai. So that's what we're going to look at today. By the way, all the pictures today, courtesy of James Tissot. Yeah, so I discovered a wonderful website. Maybe I'll share it with you next week. I forgot to write it down. Where it's the Jewish Museum in New York City, and they have a bunch of his pictures online of just the Old Testament Tissot pictures. So you may have never seen these before because I just found these. It's a great stash. So let's follow them. This is going to take a little bit of time, so be patient to kind of get the backstory put together. So I'm going to do a kind of a thumbnail backstory of Abram and Sarai. So by the way, so they leave Mesopotamia. You know, Mesopotamia is current-day Iraq, right at the top of the Persian Gulf. They leave Mesopotamia, which I always called at the time the New York City of the world. So they left the most civilized, highbrow, elite place you can live in the world, and God called them both to leave there with Abram's father initially, to leave there and to go to a land, God said, that I'm promised to give to your descendants. What? Yes. So here's the promise. He says, relocate to this land of promise, which is why we call the land of promise the Promised land. Whose promise? From God to Abram. Yeah, the land of promise. So he does. He goes, he leaves with his father. His father dies along the way, but eventually they make it to this land of promise, which is today the Middle East. It's Israel, and they go there. There's other people living there. And the promise specifically is, Abram, you're going to have a son, and from that son, a nation of descendants will come, and they will come and populate this land. There you go. And you won't even be able to number how many of them there are. So Abram says, well, okay. and he does this. So this is the promise. So they make it to this promised land, and now they're waiting for a son. This is specifically what God said in Genesis 12. Verse 7, the first half, then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. To your offspring. So remember that. I will give you this land. So they go there, but the problem is waiting for this child is going to be problematic because Abram's 75, his wife is 10 years younger. When the proposal from God is to go to the promised land and wait for a son and build a nation, 75, 65. And you may be thinking, okay, wait a second. In the Old Testament, people were they were really old, right? So maybe 75, 65 is a good time to have babies. No, even in the story when you read it, it's not a good time to have babies. They are both a little bit flummoxed by how God's going to do this, but they do. They go to this land of promise. They camp in the middle of it with all these other wild people that are already camped there, living there, and their whole task is to wait for this baby to show up. And Sarai is going, well, I don't know, 65, tick, 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 biological clock. I don't know. We'll see how this goes. And so they camp and they wait for a son. And then months go by and months go by and years go by and there's no baby and there's no son. How are we supposed to do this? You can't really force this to happen, but it is a frustration to them as they're doing this. Well, while they're there kind of chilling, waiting for a baby, there's a famine. There's a famine in the land. And so in the Old Testament, when there's a famine, you always go to Egypt. You go to Egypt because then the Nile fertilizes the Nile Delta. It's always got food. Jesus' parents did that. So they go to Egypt. So they leave this land of promise, at least for a while. It's temporary. And they go off to Egypt. But while they're in Egypt, oh my gosh, Abraham does an incredibly stupid thing. Incredibly stupid. And when you think about it, this is a bad place to be this incredibly stupid, because even though Mesopotamia may be the New York City of the world, Egypt and the Pharaoh there is the military might of the world. And so he goes there in the midst of it, and he does an incredibly stupid thing. If you want to find out what it is, I'm not going to tell you. It's Genesis 12. But as a result of doing this incredibly stupid thing, which, by the way, he'll do twice in his lifetime. Yeah. He does incredible. And what happens is he has a personal face-to-face with the most powerful military man in the world. And this military man is so angry at Abram that you'd think he would kill him on the spot. Instead, this Pharaoh, military chief of the world, rebukes Abraham. He rebukes him. Abram, I should keep saying. He rebukes him. And he's terrified and angry. And in the end, he gives him all these riches and says, get out of town. What? You got to read it. It's in chapter 12 of Genesis. I'm not kidding you. This is just crazy stuff. So when that's all over, after Abram does an extraordinarily stupid thing, by the way, it's a great message for husbands as well as wives. In fact, in 1 Peter, we looked at 1 Peter at the beginning of 2021, and we saw the stupid thing I'm talking about back in 1 Peter. Because as a result, when Peter writes his letter and his admonitions to husbands and wives, he quotes this moment when Abram is stupid. So it's a great message for men. Actually, it's a better message for women, because Peter says, I want you to do what Sarah did. Anyway, okay, so they come back rich with what? Well, chapter 13 in Genesis says silver, gold, and livestock. I mean, he's a rich man because he did something incredibly stupid. Now, don't think if you do something extraordinarily stupid, you're always going to be repaid with riches and wealth and livestock. Okay? Don't think. But he does return rich. When they get back to this land of promise, he and his nephew Lot, who both have flocks, and now they've presumably grown a lot, but they started with these flocks from Egypt, presumably. Some they brought back from Mesopotamia. Anyway, they grow so big that Abram and Lot, his nephew who's with him, Abram says, look, we gotta separate our herds. There's not enough space here for the two of us. So we just got to pick places to be. We're going to spread out in this land of promise. And so Abram and Lot have this discussion. And actually, it's not so much that the flocks are so big, but that their sheep herders can't get along with each other. And that's what it says in the passage. So Abram says, let's just split up. And in a wonderfully gracious way, Abram says, I'll let you choose, Lot. I'll let you choose. It's like when you tell your kids, cut this piece of pie in half. Whoever cuts it, then the other person gets to choose. Well, Abram looks at Lot and says, let's choose. Abram looks down into the valley, in that central valley in Israel where the Jordan River is and down where the Dead Sea is. And it's actually very green at the time, especially in the southern half. And Lot says, well, that's where I'm going to go down there. And Abram says, fine. And Abram actually stays in the highlands above that. Well, that lowland that he goes to is very famous to us. Abram stays up in the hill country, Hebron, which is actually in the southern highlands of Israel. And this is what he says. As he goes there and chooses his land, again, God reiterates to Abram, for all the land that you see, I'll give to you and to your offspring forever. So, okay. But then Lot goes down to the low country of Sodom. That Sodom? And when you read the narrative in Genesis, the author adds this little thing like, yeah, that's Sodom. It was really messed up. But that's in his vernacular. Okay, so they split up and they do that. Well, we're still in the land waiting for a baby to come, and this son is going to actually start the population game. And so we're having adventures with Pharaoh, and I didn't die. We're rich because of that. We have flocks. We're growing here. But really, if this land belongs to the offspring of Abram and Sarai, we're waiting for the baby. Tick, 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 tick. Bio clocks are going, and we're not talking about days and weeks and months. Now we're talking years. And God says this offspring is going to happen. Well, there's more adventures as they're waiting for this baby. There's war in Sodom. What do you mean? Yeah, there's actually a large land war in Sodom. I say 4K versus 5K. That's 4 kings of kingdoms versus 5 kings of kingdoms. There's a massive land war in Sodom that involves 9 kings, 4 against 5. And they battle right there, smack dab, where Lot says, I'll live down there. And as a result of this war, the guys who invaded from the north, they win, and they take Lot and his family captive as booty. They say, we won, we're taking everything down here, everything in Sodom, everything that's down here, all the kings from the south, and oh, by the way, Lot and everything he's got. And they take it, and they're gone, and they go to the north, and they're out of there. And Abram's still up on the hill country in Hebron. He's up there, and he's watching it. And someone comes to him and says, you know what? They took your your nephew, and he's off up in the north, and he's captive now. They took him and his wives and his children and his stuff and his flocks, and they're all gone. So Abram mounts a rescue, and it's a great rescue. Abram mounts a rescue against a bunch of affiliated kings of the north? He does. And does he win? He does. He's victorious. You can read about it in Genesis 14. He goes up there, he rescues Lot and his family, and brings all the stuff back, and brings back also all the stuff of Sodom that they took from the south. And he brings all this stuff back. He must have had, caravans of trucks. I mean, this is a lot of stuff that he brings back single-handedly. He comes back to the south. He comes to the presence of the king of Sodom and all those people down there and says, look, this is yours. This is Lot and my family. Just let them live here. And it's a great victory. And then when he comes back, he's actually welcomed back home by one of the most intriguing, mysterious guys in the entire Old Testament. I hear his name, yes. Yeah, Melchizedek. Yeah. Melchi, king, Zedek, righteousness. King of righteousness. You can read about it yourself. I'm not going to tell you about him right now. We've talked about him a lot. Anyway, Abram's welcomed back by this guy who's a priest of the Most High God. And now they've had lots of adventures, but they haven't had a son. And tick, 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 years. I mean, didn't God say, I can hear Sarai saying this to Abram, didn't God say that all this land, that our offspring would be in this land? So where are the offspring? We got to start with a son. I can hear the dinner table conversation. He's going, oh, honey, it's going to happen. It'll be okay. Well, when's it going to happen? I'm like really old, and now I'm older now. So Abram decides to complain to God. And he complains to God in a respectful way. And he comes to God and says, look, we need this son. This is getting difficult. Home life is bad. Now I'm actually adding some words in his mouth, but I'm sure there's a lot of friction going on at home. We need this son. We love the adventures here in this land of promise, but hey, we got to start this new nation. So where's the son? And so while he's having this discussion with God, a wonderful thing happens. God pulls him out. This is in chapter 15. He pulls him out under the stars and says to Abram, dude. Well, that's not in the Old Testament. But he says, look, you need to look at the sky and look at the stars. And in that discussion he has with Abram as he's staring up at the stars, and God says, I made all of these so I can make all of the nation from your offspring. So makes this connection. Abram goes, oh, a light bulb goes off in his head, and suddenly he has a belief, faith moment that happens when God puts these together. And he says, I'm the creator who's making this promise to you. And Abram finds faith. He believes. And this is such an important turning point in Abram's life that the Apostle Paul uses this moment to build almost his entire message in Romans. From this? Yes. Where? I wrote it down right there. You probably can't see it. I do it so I can sneak it on there. Romans 4, you'll see it. But this is in Genesis 15 that he has this moment. And so if up to this point, Abram disbelieved that God could really pull off this son thing, at this point, he's solidly in. God can do this. He's in. And as a result, God looks at his faith, his belief in that moment, and counts it to him as righteousness. And that's where the Apostle Paul reads this and goes, he looks at his faith and counts that as righteousness? He's right before God? Boom! Romans. You got to go read Romans. He's all over this whole moment. When you read this moment in Genesis 15, and then you see what Paul makes of it in Romans, especially in chapter 4 and on, it's astonishing. It makes a lot of sense. A lot of light bulbs will go off with you. Anyway, suffice it to say, the son thing, that issue is done with Abram. He's got it down. And at that moment, after Abram comes to this point of believing, God does a covenant ceremony that's, for us, is very foreign. When you read it, you go, what in the world? You want me to cut this animal in half? And then I'm going to walk through the middle of it? Like, whoa, this is just weird. Well, it was pretty typical at the time, but it was a way for God to formalize his promise and his covenant to Abram. This is really going to happen. And just to really cement the deal here, we're going to sign the contract by doing this very well-known, full of symbology thing where we walk between two halves of a dead animal. I know, it's kind of weird. We don't do that today. Really. I mean, it would be like if you closed on a house, instead of going to the title office, I need to sign my half, you need to sign your half. Instead, you go down there and you'd get a cow and you'd cut it in half in the title office and you'd split the two halves on each side and you'd walk through the midst of it. And then you'd have beef for a year. So that's not really such a bad deal. So anyway. Okay. Here's the covenant again. This is how it's expressed. Genesis 15:18. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring, I'll give this land. Now look how big it is. From the river of Egypt, Nile, to the great river, the river Euphrates. It's huge. I know. When you read that, you go, that's bigger than Israel today. Yes, indeed, it is. It actually is. However, during the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel was attacked by three of its neighbors, one of them being Egypt, it turns out as a fallout of those 6 days of conflict, Israel had pushed Egypt all the way past the Sinai Desert up to the Nile River. Israel, for a while, owned everything east of the Nile River. And in order to establish some peace in the area, they gave it all back. So you can have that back. It's a big piece of desert anyway. Nobody really wants it. But they could have kept it. And to this day, the entire Sinai could be Israel, which would actually... And at the time, some leaders in Israel said, well, there's that covenant to Abram saying maybe this was always ours. But they gave it back. And they also, in the Six-Day War, at the end of the 6 days of stuff, then not only did they push Egypt back to the Nile River in the south, but in the north, when Syria had come in and invaded the north around the Sea of Galilee and from Damascus up there, the Israeli forces pushed back the Syrian forces all the way to Damascus. All the way to Damascus. That's the capital of Syria. Yes. And so they decided as well, in order to preserve the peace after that conflict, that they would give that land back to Syria. Good idea. But they didn't give it all back. They kept back the part that's right around the Sea of Galilee, which you know as the Golan Heights, just as a defensive barrier. So from the Golan Heights, you can get your binoculars, and you can see the tanks and the planes coming from Damascus. So they kept that defensively. A little historical moment. Anyway, the promise to Abram is big. It's a huge area. Well, okay, that might be the case, Abram's thinking, but where's the baby? And in fact, Abram's not saying it so much now as Sarai is. She loses her patience because she says it's been 10 years. 10 years since this promise. Well, Abram has had this faith moment in the desert under the stars, but Sarai has not had this. And so she's really, really miffed about the entire thing. 10 stinking years, which would make her the age of math whizzes. Where's all the math whizzes? They left Mesopotamia when he was 75 and she was 65, and now we're 10 years later, so Sarai is 75, yeah. So if she complained at the beginning that she couldn't actually make babies at 65, it's worse now. Now we're at 75 for her. It's 85 for Abram. So she's a little bit miffed. And she's probably, and this is Jim's speculation, I think she's slightly miffed about the fact that Abram has had this confirmation from God under the stars, but she hasn't. And she's the one that's got to make the baby after all. Right? So she hatches a plan to help. It's always a good idea to try and help God when he doesn't come through. Right, not. I didn't really say that. So, but she does come up with a plan, and her plan seems, well, it's actually more rational than you might think. But she comes up with this plan, and that brings us finally to the passage today. Okay, we're in chapter 16 of Genesis. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. So she had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. Hagar, okay. And Sarai said to Abram, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. By the way, if you're an aficionado of modern novels, this is the core of The Handmaid's Tale. If you know The Handmaid's Tale, it's from this. Well, so here's what is suggested from Sarai. She says, I'm not making babies, so maybe, and God closed my womb. So she's blaming God right here. This is God's fault. I should be making babies, and it's not happening. So I do have this servant who is mine, legally owned by her, and this servant is, if you sleep with her and she makes a baby, since she belongs to me, the baby belongs to me, and then that's our child. Woohoo! Now, it's not a really foreign idea. This actually happened a lot. If you look at the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons that were the 12 tribes of Israel, they had 4 mothers. What? Yeah, they had 4 mothers. 2 of them being sisters, blood related, 2 of them being the servants of the 2 sisters. So the idea in the ancient age, which was, if you have a baby that comes from a servant, that baby actually legally belongs to the family. Blood-wise, not really, but legally, yes. So it was a kind of a complicated in-between status that they had. So she recommends, she says, this works for other people. So let's just do this. We're going to take the bull by the horns. We're going to make ourselves a baby boy. You're going to have to do it through Hagar, because clearly I can't do it. That, by the way, that's a premise of Handmaid's Tale, is a future world where basically almost all women are infertile. But some are fertile, and using this as a rationale, they force the few fertile women to have babies for all the powerful men in the world. Okay. Well, anyway, Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. I thought he had his faith and belief moment. I thought he would stand up right here and say, Sarai, not on your life. We're not going to do that. God has told me it's going to be my offspring. But in a sense, this is his offspring legally. So he's listening to his wife. He goes, okay. Oh, darn. Well, verse 3. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. They slept together. So where did Hagar come from? Egypt. When were they in Egypt? During the famine. And during the famine, Pharaoh came out and gave them huge riches in terms of silver and gold and animals and servants. And here's one of them, right here. Oh, no. Okay. So he went into Hagar. That's euphemistic Old Testament for sleeping together. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. Woohoo! Everyone's happy. Sort of. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Bad move. Bad move. I mean, she's the servant of these 2 people. If they let her go, she's defenseless. She's on her own. So Hagar realizes that she's conceived. She hasn't had the baby yet. But she knows she's conceived. And basically she goes, na to Sarai. Like, right? And that's what she does. This is so predictable. Don't do this. This is why this is, really. So Sarai says to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. It's your fault that this happened. It's your fault that this happened. It's on you. She hates me now. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. It's your fault this happened. actually, this is so predictable. Any of us could have said, you may not want to really do this. But in the crowd of us and everyone in the tent at the time, it seems like the only person who didn't see this coming was Sarai. It blindsided her. And then she blames Abram. And so she says, may the Lord judge between you and me. So what she's saying is, who's right and wrong in this situation? Is it me that's right, or is it you that's right, my husband? I want the Lord to judge between you and me. Who really did wrong here, and may his justice come down on us? And it's your fault anyway. So she's pulling down the justice of heaven on top of Abram. And you could see this coming a mile away. Oh, man. But Abram said to Sarai, look, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Come on, get off my back and just do something with this woman. You own her. So, do something. So Sarah dealt harshly with her. Moses doesn't tell us in Genesis what that means, but it was enough that she said, I'm out of here, and she fled from her. See, and she flees. Now, this is almost certainly a death sentence on Hagar. I mean, she's in a foreign country. She's not in Egypt anymore. It's pretty bad. And so the scene shifts to where she's out in the middle of nowhere as she's fled from her. And if they're still in Hebron in the south, it's right on the edge of the Negev desert. It's barren. It's rocks and barren. There's not even this much vegetation out there. So she's out in the middle of nowhere. She just flees. There's no message. There's nothing that tells us that she actually took stuff with her. She might have taken a little water. We don't know. But I mean, she just flees. This is dangerous for her. So at this point in life, okay, I'm going to stop for a second. At this point in life, when I'm in a tough fix like this, when I have put myself in a stupid situation, however, it could have been untenable to stay with Sarai. But if she's out here, what I do, because I'm trained as an engineer, I take a piece of paper and I draw a line down the middle of my piece of paper, and I list the pros on the left and the cons on the right of my situation. And in the clear thinking of analyzing my situation, I come up with the best fit for what to do next. Very, very engineer-like, isn't it? Or the option is you could run around out there with your hair on fire and not get anywhere. So this is what I would do. So I put myself in Hagar's sandals, and I thought, okay, let's make a list. Let's see what our situation is. Let's start on the pros side. I didn't get anything either on the pros. So let's go to the con side. We'll go to the con side. On the con side, well, I'm alone. That's a bad thing. That's a very bad thing. Also, I don't have any family out here that I can go knock on their doors and say, let me in. My master kicked me out. Can't do that. Not only there's no family who would be obligated to do that, but I don't even have any friends I can lean on out here. I don't know anybody out here. I'm an Egyptian, right? I'm an Egyptian. I don't have any connections anywhere out here. I'm stuck out in the middle of nowhere's land. And then finally, I'm a servant girl, so I have absolutely no social status in the world. Even if I could find somebody out here, it's not going to work. So then I went back to the pros again. And I still didn't get anything. So she's in a world of hurt. This is a death sentence position that she's in right here. And she is all alone in the middle of nowhere. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring that's on the way to Shur. She didn't think anyone saw her. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? Now, that's an interesting comment first, because he knows her name. I think he knows more about her background than he's letting on, which is why if he knows her name, Hagar, servant of Sarai, yeah, that's right. So what are your plans? Where'd you come from? Where are you going? Well, it's easy to answer the first question. So she answers that in a second here. Go ahead. So she says, well, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. She doesn't answer the second question because she doesn't know. Where are you going? Well, this is right here is as far as I've thought ahead, and I'm just right here. Yeah. But I do think it's interesting. Where do you come from and where are you going? This is not a request for information from heaven. This isn't heaven saying, listen, Mr. Angel, go down there and find out what she's planning to do. Because God knows who she is. He knows her circumstance. He knows what's going to happen next, in fact. God's in a timeless realm. He can look just to the next chapter that's right on the book, and he knows what's going to happen next. So this is not for the benefit of data collection for heaven. This is for her benefit. This is the heaven's way of saying to her, make your pro-con sheet, and let's look at what, so you assess your situation. Where'd you come from? Where are you going? Okay, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. And then the angel of the Lord said to her, well, you need to return to your mistress and submit to her. What? I don't think so. Well, yeah. You need to return. And the angel of the Lord also said to her, look, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. So look, go back, and the child will survive. And actually, that child will have a huge list of descendants, which will form a nation as well. So that child won't suffer in the hands of Sarai. This child will live and actually spawn so many people. So he's saying that's what the future is all about. You need to go back and return to your mistress, and if you do, I guarantee this is what's going to happen. So that's a little bit of assurance, but still, man, when she left the tent with Sarai, so she was get out of here, and so she was scared for her life, so much so that she's willing to risk her life in the desert. So it's a bad situation to go back to. And then the angel of the Lord goes on, says to her, behold, you are pregnant. See, I knew he knew more than he was letting on. Yeah. So you're pregnant and shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. So this is what's going to happen. So when the angel asks her, what's your past and what's your future? Where have you come from? Where are you going to? She can only answer where I've come from. And then he answers the question where you're going to. You're going to go back to Sarai. You're going to submit to her. You're going to submit to her. Not just go back. You're going to submit to her. And, by the way, you're eventually going to have a baby. This baby is going to be named Ishmael, and then a huge nation will come out of Ishmael. Oh, okay. Great reassurances. He shall be... Here's the downside. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So this is like a good news, bad news. I'll tell you what's going to happen. You're going to go back to Sarai. You're going to have this baby. You're going to name him Ishmael. But by the way, Ishmael and his descendants are not going to be a real great bunch of people. I mean, they're going to be fighting amongst themselves and against each other, and the world's going to be against them. Just saying, this is what's going on. I just want to be up with you about what's going up in the future. So not only does the angel give her an idea of what's happening up to the birth of this child, but also what's going to happen from this child for millennia afterwards. Wow. I don't know if I'd ever, well, you can check me on this. I don't know if I'd ever want to have God when my children were still, in the womb. I don't know if I'd want God to say what's going to happen to this child and all the chaos that's going to come from them. Well, good news, bad news. They're going to turn into an axe murderer, and you're going to regret it for the rest of your life. But hey, you're going to have a baby. Well, I don't know. So anyway, this is just a reality. This is reality. And to this very day, a large portion of the Middle Eastern world call themselves Ishmaelites. And their descendants of it. And when you look at the conflict, I mentioned the 6-Day War, and there's been so many conflicts in the region. This is this is more than just prophetic. This is genuinely what has been going on in the conflicts. Everyone asks, why is there so much conflict in the Middle East? There's lots of answers to that, but this is a component of it. And there you go. All right. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. Now this is interesting because at this point she answers back. And in ignorance, remember, she's an Egyptian. She's not an Israelite. She knows about the promise to Abram and Sarai, but it's a promise to a couple. It's not a promise to a nation. So this God that Abram is following is very foreign to her. So when this good thing happens, she decides, I need to name this God. Now, when you name something in ancient times, and it has worked actually into the modern times in some cultures, you name the child or you name the person based on their chief characteristic. right? So for instance, I was named James when I was born, but when I got through puberty and in my young youthfulness of life, people would look at me and say, "Hey, handsome." So they would change my name to Handsome. Why are you laughing? So chief characteristics. So chief characteristics is what the new name would be. That's what Jesus did with Peter. Remember when we looked at Peter? You're going to be stone. You're going to be a little rock. You're going to be something that's immovable. That faith that he had. So she decides it's time to name this Lord, who I don't know who's talking to me, but I'll name him based on his chief characteristic. And you know what the chief characteristic she gives to this God that she's just been introduced to? You are a God of seeing. You see me. This is amazing. You see me. And not only that, it's twofold. You see me. And she said one other thing. Truly here I have seen him who looks after me. So not only is it he's seen me, but I've seen him, and he looks after. That's also a visual thing as well. This is a remarkable thing in her mind, because when you look at the pagan traditions of gods, which are all uninformed and wrong, they're always gods who are very remote from mankind. They couldn't give a rip about what we're going through. They don't see anything. They can if they want to, but they just don't care. Humanity is too below them. They don't see me. They say, good luck with everything. By the way, you have to make sacrifices to me because I need your sacrifices as a God to exist. But beyond that, I don't care what you do. That's the pagan idea of a God. So to have a God who is so intensely personal and sees her circumstance when no one sees her circumstance, where she was out in the desert and no one sees me. No one sees me. No one can see me to rescue me because no one sees me. I'm worthless. I'm not part of Abram's household anymore. I have no status at all. I've been exiled in the midst of this land. You are a God of seeing. You see me. Truly here I have seen him who looks after me. We'll come back to this couplet in a second, because this is just a powerful thing. We've been working all morning to get to that picture right there, and we'll come back to it in a second. So at the end of the story, therefore the well was called Be'er Lahai Roi. I practiced that. Yeah, Be'er Lahai Roi. By the way, never mind. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. So there was a well that she was at there. She was drawing water, and now it became famous for this event right here. And so she named the well as well. Okay, let's do a little wrap up. Thank you, James Tissot. That's his picture of her being at the well, drawing water. What the angel looked like, they have no clue what he looks like. But I do want to focus on those phrases again. You are a God of seeing, and truly here I have seen him who looks after me. So this is the big application for people who feel like no one sees them. Hagar has nothing going for her at all. Nothing going for her. In fact, she was mistreated by people who technically were in God's inner circle. And she was mistreated. Now she's out here dying. So she feels like, well, God sees Abram and Sarai, because after all, that's why they came out of Mesopotamia. But now that I've gone in bad with Sarai and I'm out here in the middle of nowhere, no one's going to see me. I'm a nothing. Who cares about my situation? Who even sees to take care of my situation? And many of us and many of the people in this world consider their circumstance worse than Hagar's. I'm here. I'm miserable. I have no friends. I have no family. I have no one who even cares to notice. And I think that's the worst thing about this status in life is not the fact like the lonely where there's no one around, but the fact that there are lots of people around and they choose not to see. They choose to look away. They choose to socially exile you in the midst of all the people that are around. That's the kind of situation that God looks at and says, my heart breaks for you. And if that's where you are, I would recommend, when you feel that isolated, that unseen, that unworthy, that you look to Hagar and say, well, Hagar was in a worse situation than I am. God sees. Well, okay, so he sees. God can see everything. But will he engage on my behalf? Will he do anything for my bad situation? Part B in Hagar's comment is very important. Not only does he see me, I've seen him, we've made connection, and he looks after me. So if you're in a situation right now where you feel like that's what's going on, you're not seen. People look past you. People don't think you're even worthy of being seen, of contact, and that no one understands my circumstance. No one understands. You can always go back to Hagar's situation and say, but God sees. But God sees. And he's looking after me. That's an astonishing statement for the God of the Old Testament. That's an astonishing statement. He sees, and he's looking after me. There's a great word in the New Testament in Greek that means to look in on somebody. It actually has a combination of seeing and visiting. And so when you see this word in the New Testament Greek, it's great because it brings this image of looking in on someone in their house when they're sick, when they're ill, right? You're doing your stuff out in the world. Other things are going on that are very important. But then someone stops to notice you're not around. They see. And what they do is they look in on me. Literally, the word means to look in on. And this is the Hebrew equivalent of that very word. He sees me and he looks after me. God, in a real sense, brings chicken soup to your lap when you're ailing. God sees you and he looks after you. And he'll allow you to recognize when he does that. I've seen him who looks in on me. So that's the big, powerful takeaway in the entire Hagar story. There are people who feel like they're unseen. There are people who've been socially exiled in our culture. People that other people look past, whether it's because of color of skin or because of low caste or because of poorness or because of whatever it is. There are people who sit in the midst of hundreds of people feeling like nobody sees me. And yet that's not God. God sees you. And he looks after you. And if it works for Hagar, who didn't even appeal to God, it'll work in your circumstance. That's the big takeaway for today. Okay. So I went back to my pro-con list. And I realized, well, now that she has had contact with this God who sees her, she can go back to her list and say, well, I was stupid, because it turns out that on my pro side is God. God's on my pro side. Yeah. Oh, yeah. He's on my pro side. Not only that, he sees me and he looks after me. Pro side. So that side of your column, when you assess crashing situations, is extraordinarily important, because that left side is what makes everything stable in the midst of chaos on the right side, right? It's easy to fill out the right side of this list. We have brains that God has given us, and we assess our circumstances, and we see our situation crumbling and falling apart, and we have imaginations beyond comprehension where you can imagine how much worse it could be, and all you do is you realize and think about it at night, it could be so much worse than it really is. It could go here. Hair on fire, run around. Or I can say, God sees. He really does. He sees, and he's looking after me. So I'll just chill, because God's on your side. It's such a profound statement for someone who benefited in the shadow of Abram, who's the father of the nation of Israel. So in this story, Abram and Sarai are not the focus. Hagar is. The nobody. The person who was given away as a prize from Pharaoh in Egypt to Abram, to get Abram out of his hair, because Pharaoh was terrified. This woman who counts for nothing. And she's actually the hero of the story. God sees her, and she realizes that he looks after me. Okay, there's an epilogue to this. We got a couple minutes. Yeah, epilogue. At least in this section of Genesis. So let me look at this real quick. So Hagar bore Abram a son. So we go fast forward 9 months. The son is born. And Abram called the name of his son whom Hagar bore. Now wait before you read the next verse. This is the firstborn son of a very important man who's not got any other children. So in the ancient context, you name this child after the man. You name this child. You know, this is just how you do this. Which is why it's funny when you see the birth of John the Baptist, and then his father Zacharias comes out and announces, well, his name's going to be John. Everyone's shocked, like, well, no, he's your firstborn son. You don't name him John. You name him Zacharias. What are you thinking, dude? So they're shocked when he says that. Actually, he has to write that on a little chalkboard to tell them that. But they're shocked by that. So even thousands of years later, when you get to the birth of John the Baptist, this is what you do. So here's Abram, who now may be seeing the only son. He's not sure, but this is his first offspring. So he should name him Abram Jr. This is what you'd expect. But he doesn't. He doesn't. In fact, he names him Ishmael. How did he know Ishmael? Because Hagar said, I got visited by God. And God said, name him Ishmael. Now, there's a little hidden meaning right here that's a rebuke to Abram in the name here. Not only did he not name him after himself, which he should have done, because, he's the firstborn, he's going to carry on. Not only did he not do that and broke those rules, but he named him something that God himself said to name him. And it's a slight rebuke because Ishmael means, remember, the name means something important? Ishmael means God hears. And so as Abram has been praying all these years for a son, every time he'd see Ishmael, he would think, well, God hears. Does that mean that Ishmael is the fulfillment of that prayer? Well, not necessarily. But in the frustration of those 10 years and the years that will follow as they wait for a real son, every time Ishmael would show up for dinner, he'd say, hey, God hears. Yeah, God hears. It's just a subtle rebuke of not only Abram, but Sarai's patience waiting for God. God hears. He knows. Come on. He hears. Of course, it came immediately out of the fact that as she was out in the desert, God heard her need. Not only did he see, but he heard. And that's also another additional nice meaning about Ishmael, because not only did she say that God sees me, but God, I've seen the one who looks after me. I've seen the one who sees me, who looks after me, who hears me. So when you put all those together, you're not alone. You're not unseen. You're noticed by God, and he cares for you. God hears. Well, Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. 86. And we're going to stop right there this morning. However, if you want to, there's a part 2 in the Hagar story, and that part 2 shows up over here in Genesis 21. You can go look at it yourself, because just as a slight plot spoiler, she gets kicked out again. But it's interesting. It's interesting to contrast the two results. Did Hagar really take to heart what she learned about the fact that God sees me and I've seen the one who cares for me? Did she really take that to heart? And do you see it engage much later in Genesis 21 when she's kicked out again? So I would just challenge you. If you're curious about how you see her change and did she learn her lesson, go see what happens in Genesis 21. And by the way, if you're on the way to Genesis 21 to find out part B of the Hagar story, because that's the last you'll hear about her, is that event happens in Genesis 21 when Isaac is born. So now we have a whole new conflict. The first conflict was on her conceiving Ishmael. The second conflict is when Isaac, the real blood son, is born. And now you have Isaac around and you have Ishmael around. And by the way, get your math going. By the way, Isaac shows up on the scene when Abram is 100. Which makes Ishmael at the time 14. It's a teenager. Probably. Yeah. So that's the context when you go to Genesis 21. And by the way, another context in Genesis 21, you got to read this. Just before Genesis 21, the chapter before Genesis 21, Abram does his second stupid thing. Again, almost a carbon copy, except this time it's not with Pharaoh. It was with another very, very powerful man in the world. He does exactly the same thing. Oh, Abram, what are you thinking? And Sarah's response, bless her heart, is exactly the same. So you have to read this. There's so much. There's just so much there. So anyway, 14 years later, Isaac is born. A new conflict erupts, and she's kicked out again. How does Hagar respond the second time? Take a look. And we're going to leave it right there, I think. Yeah, because we're going to do that. Oh, God, you are my God, and I will ever praise you. The Step by Step is a song by Rich Mullins where he talks about the fact that tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that, you put your trust in God. Did Hagar eventually put her trust in this foreign God she knew nothing about? You'll find out in Genesis 21. But we look in our present circumstance when we think God doesn't see us, God doesn't care about us, God doesn't even pay us the time of day, but he does. He sees, his heart breaks for your circumstance, and he allows us to see him looking in on us. And that's the good news of the Bible, a God who cares for his creation. Okay, let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for your great love for us. We thank you for this one particular circumstance where we get to learn so much about your care for the people who feel unseen, who feel as though their circumstance is being ignored by the rich and the powerful, who feel as a result that in their exile they don't measure up to take place in society at all. And Lord, for many of us, right now, we feel like we're in that circumstance. Does anyone see? Does God even see? So, Lord, I pray that you would come to those in their exile, that you would demonstrate to them that you do see, you do notice, and you are compelled out of love to look in on us and to care for us. Thank you for your tremendous love toward us. We understand the unfolding of the magnitude of your love throughout the whole Bible, right here so early in Genesis, that you would intercede for a servant girl who was given away from Egypt as worthless and who was exiled to the desert, but you saw and you looked after her. This is a God who loves. So thanks for this story in Jesus' name. Amen.